Hi there. Today we are going to be reviewing Unit 4, which dealt with quadratic relationships and the zeros that go with them. So we started off the unit learning how to factor, and there were several different types of factoring, so we're going to review them all. The first type of factoring was the common factor. So we just write CF for common factoring. With common factoring, what you were looking for is what number can you divide into both terms. And so we're looking for the greatest common factor. If the first term is negative, you must take the negative out with the greatest common factor. Both 4 and 28 can be divided by 4, and both x squared and x can be divided by just 1x. So your greatest common factor is negative 4x. The greatest common factor is put at the beginning. Then what you do is, to find out what goes in the bracket, you divide each of these terms by the greatest common factor. So negative 4x squared divided by negative 4x is just x. Negative 28x divided by negative 4x is positive 7. And that's what you do for greatest common factoring. Common factoring is the factoring that you should check for first. As soon as you see a question, you should always check for a common factor first. The next type of factoring we did dealt with a simple trinomial. So a simple trinomial starts with an x squared, then it has an x term, and then it has a constant. There is no number in front of the x squared term. So all you have to do with simple trinomials is find two numbers that have to multiply to give you 12 and add to give you negative 7. So think, what multiplies to give 12 and adds to give negative 7? If you struggle with this, try to think of things first that multiply to 12 and then see if you can manipulate them to add up to negative 7. So for instance, 6 times 2 multiplies to 12, but you can't use a 6 and a 2 to make a negative 7. 4 times 3 multiplies to 12. If they're both negative, they still multiply to negative 12 and they add to negative 7. So the numbers are negative 4 and negative 3. With simple trinomials, once you find those two numbers, all you have to do is put them into brackets. So x minus 4, x minus 3. If you were to FOIL that out, you would be back to the beginning. Just like if you were to use the distributive property on this question, you would be back to the beginning. So that's simple trinomial. If you take a look at this question, some of you might look at this and say that that's a tricky trinomial. But check for common factors first. This question has a greatest common factor of 4. Because all terms can be divided by 4. So we would first common factor this. So put the common factor of 4 on the outside. Divide everything by 4, so we will get x squared minus 7x plus 10. Now we have a simple trinomial. So can you find two numbers that multiply to 10 and add to negative 7? And those numbers would be negative 5 and negative 2. So those numbers, you still have to keep the 4 on the outside, but the negative 5 and the negative 2 go straight into the brackets. So again, as soon as you see a question, before you decide whether it's a simple trinomial, a tricky trinomial, a difference of squares, or whatever, common factor it first. That should always be your first step. question D, this was a difference of squares. Difference of squares had two terms. They're both perfect squares, and they have a subtraction sign in between. In order to factor a difference of squares, you will have two sets of brackets. Take the square root of the first term. That gives you 6x. You put it at the beginning of each bracket. Square root the last term. That would be 7. You put that at the end of each bracket. And then there's a plus sign in between the first bracket and a minus sign in between the second bracket. If you were to FOIL this out, the reason you need 1 plus and 1 minus is because you'd have negative 42x, positive 42x. That makes 0, and that's why there's no x term. So that's how you factor a difference of squares. Lastly, the tricky trinomial. In order to factor this, you had to take the 10 and multiply it by the negative 3. And now in this case, you need to find two numbers that multiply to negative 30. And the negative 30 comes from 10 times negative 3. And they have to add up to the middle number. And remember, when there's no middle number showing, the coefficient is 1. So they have to add up to 1. Again, think of things that multiply to negative 30 and see if you can manipulate them to add to 1. So 10 times 3 multiplies, or negative 10 times 3 multiplies to negative 30, but you can't use that to make a 1. 6 and 5 can make a 30. One of them's got to be negative. Has to add up to positive 1. So that means it would be negative 5 and positive 6. I'll remind you, when one of these numbers is positive and one of these numbers is negative, it's easiest if the negative one comes first. So we're going to rewrite this. The 10x squared is going to stay alone. The 1x is going to change into negative 5x plus 6x. And then the minus 3 will stay alone. Now what you do is take the first two terms and factor them. So common factor the first two terms. The greatest common factor is 5x, and you are left with 2x minus 1. Now common factor the last two terms. The greatest common factor would be positive 3, and you are left with 2x minus 1. If you did this correctly, both of these brackets should be the same. And the first bracket in your answer will be that 2x minus 1. The second bracket in your answer will be what's left over, which is the 5x plus 3. So those are your different types of factoring. Make sure you do know how to do all those types of factoring for the exam and the summative. We also looked at solving by factoring, which also means finding the zeros. So the first thing you had to do is to figure out what type of factoring this was. So this is a simple trinomial. So what are two numbers that multiply to negative 12 and add to 4? Those numbers are 6 and negative 2. So since it's a simple trinomial, you just have to put those numbers straight into the brackets. Then to find the zeros, anytime it says solve, you have to go further and find the zeros. You have to take each bracket, set it equal to 0, and solve for x. So here you will subtract 6 from both sides. So one of the zeros or solutions is 6. Take the other bracket, set it equal to 0, solve for x in this case by adding 2 to both sides. So the other zero or solution is positive 2. Those are your two solutions or your two zeros. For question B, this type of factoring is common factoring. So the greatest common factor would be 2x, and you are left with 3x plus 2. Don't forget to write the equals 0 at the end of each line. Once again, take each factor, set it equal to 0, and solve for x. In this case, you're going to divide both sides by 2. So x equals 0 is one of your answers. Take the next bracket, or the next factor, set it equal to 0, and solve for x. So we're first going to subtract 2 from both sides, and now we're going to divide both sides by -3. So these are your two solutions, or your two zeros, to this equation. We also learned how to solve quadratic equations, or find the zeros again. This means find the zeros, by using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is used for any equation, or you can use it for any equation, but it's mostly useful for equations that can't factor. For instance, this simple trinomial, you cannot find two numbers that multiply to -1 and add to -4. If you can solve a quadratic equation by factoring, it's typically faster, but not everybody likes factoring, and not all equations can factor. So that's where the quadratic formula is useful. The equation is x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. As a reminder, the number in front of the x squared is the a, the number in front of the x is the b, and the constant term is the c. I'll also remind you that if b is negative, this negative is not the same as that negative. So when you go to solve this, -b will end up being negative, and then your b is -4, because there is your -b. Plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Please make sure when your b is negative that you are using brackets to substitute. The double negative becomes a positive. Your next step is to figure out what is underneath the square root sign. Do all of this in one step and use your calculator. When using your calculator here, you get that that is equal to 20. Next, what you're going to do is take the square root of 20, and it says to round to 2 decimal places. So the square root of 20 is 4.47. Now, to get your two zeros, one zero is found by using the plus sign. 4 plus 4.47 over 2. That is 8.47 over 2. And that is 4.24 when rounded to 2 decimal places. So we're out of time for this video. We'll finish this in part 2. Please do not forget to watch part 2. Thank you.